My name is Margot Hayes. I am 71 now, but the voice you hear in this part of the story belongs to the woman I was at 66, raw with loss, stunned, and very, very tired. I want you to listen like you are holding my hand on a cold morning. That's how I tell it. Simple, honest. It began on a gray day at a small cemetery. Rain wanted to fall but had not yet decided. The priest murmured words about the soul, about rest. People spoke in low voices. I remember only the smell of wet dirt and my own breath fogging out in little clouds, as if my body too did not want to be there. Ernest was gone. That fact felt like a cold stone inside me. 42 years of marriage carried away in a hospital room and in the hands of people who said they would take care of everything. I thought I knew sorrow. Losing my mother taught me how to fold grief into daily life. But this was different. This was a cut that opened and wanted to swallow the world. We had shared the same small town for decades, Spring Creek. The town moves slow, like the river at the edge, and everyone knows which house has the best pie, whose dog needs a vet, who sneaks extra sugar into church coffee. Ernest fixed bicycles, oil on his fingers, a laugh that sounded like the clinking of tools. I sewed dresses for neighbors, mended sleeves, patched knees. We had a tin roof that rattled in storms and little pots set out to catch leaks. We had enough and we had each other. That was our wealth. At the graveside, shoulders and faces blurred together. Charles and Henry stood there, my sons. Men who once fell asleep on the porch in their shorts, who smeared jam on their chins and asked for one more bedtime story. Now they stood like strangers, tidy, checked, like men who had stepped out of city taxis and into a village funeral. Their faces were controlled. Their hugs felt like rehearsed lines. My hands were full of flowers I did not want to put down. Then my phone buzzed, a tiny sound, a bright little interruption. I had expected condolences, a blurred message from a cousin, a neighbor saying, "I'm so sorry." I did not expect words that read like a knife. "I'm alive." That's not me in the casket. My hands stopped working. My throat closed. I typed with fingers that did not belong to me. "Who are you?" My thumbs trembled. The reply came fast. I can't say. "They're watching. Don't trust our sons." If you have never had your world rearranged by a few letters on a small screen, you cannot imagine how small that moment felt and how loud. The text sat there like a foreign bird on a windowsill watching. I slid the phone into my purse like it might burn. I stood by the grave, the sound of dirt hitting wood like the end of everything. I looked up and saw Charles's face. He looked surprised, as anyone would be at a funeral. His eyes shifted to mine, and in that shift I saw something I could not name. A look that was too calm. "Are you all right, Mom?" he said, voice steady. I said I was fine because I did not know what else to say. I wanted to show him my hands, my phone, the screen. I wanted to shove the truth at him with all the force my grief allowed. Instead, I folded the phone against my chest and walked home. That night, the house felt like a set. The kettle on the stove, Ernest's mug still on the table, the smell of tobacco in a chair cushion, his boots by the door. I moved through the house like someone pretending to belong. I made meatloaf because that's what he loved. My hands trembled over the pan. I set a plate at the table for a man who would not come home. We had been poor once. We had been proud. We had learned to be careful with the pennies and brave with the heart. We raised 2 boys who wanted more than we had. That longing became their compass. It fed them and changed them. It was easy at first to think the change was not cruel, just the natural arc of people reaching. But that night my grief tasted different. It tasted of questions. When someone you love dies suddenly, you start a list by habit. You check the last time you saw them, the words that hung between you, the small signs you could have missed. I opened Ernest's small metal box in the desk like I was peeling an apple. Insurance papers, receipts, handwritten notes. His handwriting had been steady all our years. There were new lines in his documents that I did not understand. A life insurance policy increased months before his death. A workers' comp policy added less than 2 months prior. Withdrawals from our savings that I did not remember. I read those receipts until the numbers blurred. I could not believe the handwriting could tremble so free on paper without him telling me. Why would Ernest change those things without mentioning it to me? He never did anything important without saying a little thing about it over coffee. The missing conversations made a hollow sound in my chest. Sleep did not come that night. My mind worked like a clock with missing gears. Who texted me at the cemetery? Who would say such a thing? Was it a cruel game? A wrong number? Or was there a hand reaching to rewrite the last acts of my life? I started writing things down. Names, dates, times, the little things he said the last week. Ernest had muttered once, "Some folks don't like being poor for long." He had looked at the boys with something like worry, but also maybe pride. He worried because he loved them and he could see their hunger. I did not think it would turn into this. Faux pause, breath in, sound, low hum. When I sleep the first few nights after Ernest's funeral, I dream of the shop. The bell above the door that used to jingle when a customer came in, the wall of tools, the grease-stained calendar. In the dream, his hands are still steady. I wake and reach for him, and my arms find only the cold of the pillow. That is how grief lives. It keeps you company, then leaves you in the kitchen at dawn, wondering how your life continued without asking permission. At breakfast the next morning, I told myself to be practical. I would go to the bank. I would check the accounts. Maybe the receipts were explained by convenience. Maybe Ernest had been making secret plans for a surprise, something tied to his stubborn wish to keep us comfortable. I told myself stories I wanted to believe. That is how we keep our peace. At the bank, Mrs. Thompson greeted me like she always had. She smelled like soap and lemon. She was part of the furniture of the town, kind, careful with numbers, and protective of people who trusted her. When she opened our file and the recent withdrawals appeared on the page, the air in the room changed. The pattern did not look like repairs. Hundreds of dollars at a time, then larger sums. Receipts with signatures that looked like Ernest's but not quite. Stiff hand, shaky letters, too shaky for the man who had once signed warranty forms with a confident line. "Did he come in with someone?" I asked, because the thought I feared was growing like mold behind the wallpaper. Mrs. Thompson hesitated and then said, "A young man. Said he was helping him with paperwork because his father had trouble reading the small print." It was the sort of explanation you give for a neighbor you feel pity for, but it was also a redirection that left me with a cold taste in my mouth. When I asked our neighbor, Doris, she said she had seen Charles at the shop a time or two with Ernest, helping him. It sounded ordinary when she said it. Ordinary until you arrange every ordinary thing beside the dates and the withdrawals and the increased policy and the timing. Then the ordinary gleamed like something made of glass. That night, another message came through. The same unknown number. "Check the bank account. See who's been taking money." It was a whisper that turned the whole house into a suspect. I tucked the phone under a pillow as if it were a fragile thing I had to protect. The voice on the screen was not just a voice. It was an ally from nowhere. I lay awake thinking of Ernest's voice on the recorder I had not yet heard, the letters in his notebook, the steady hand that had written things I am only now piecing together. When you lose someone you love, you find their voice in odd places. In a folded shirt, in the scent on a pillow, in a note tucked away. It is cruel that you notice everything only after it is too late to ask. By the end of the first week, the unknown messages felt less like a nuisance and more like a map. Someone was telling me what to look at and where to go. I wanted to scream their name into the emptiness. I wanted to find them so I could say thank you for not letting my grief become a prison of lies. But for every step I took, there was another reason to be careful. Charles and Henry moved with the efficiency of people who no longer felt accountable for their parents' feelings. They arranged the funeral quickly, signed paperwork that made me feel left out of the last decisions in my husband's life, and talked about funeral costs with a tone that made me want to vomit. I would not let that be the last of my story. Cut to close-up on Margot's hands, holding a photograph of Ernest. Sound, faint ticking clock. Oh, quiet. I closed the metal box and slid it back into the desk. The house felt heavier tonight, like someone had added a coat of shadow. My heart hammered in my chest in time with the sound of the clock. I held the photograph close until the paper warmed from my hands. Tomorrow I would go to the shop. If there had been an explosion, like they had said, I would find rubble. If not, then perhaps my husband's dying had a name. I did not know then how quickly the world would change, how the quiet of a small town could hide a storm, or how a single text at a graveside would grow into a fight for truth. I only knew this. The ground had opened under me, and I had to decide whether to fall in or to climb out. I went to the hospital the way people go to a place that might break them, slow, with small prayers forming in the mouth. The nurse's station smelled of antiseptic and lemon. It felt like a place that wanted to keep everything clean and tidy, including pain. They let me into the ICU in short bursts. 5 minutes, then leave. 5 minutes, then go. That rule seemed to belong to a different world, one where grief can be scheduled. But when I saw him, Ernest, hooked to machines and wrapped in bandages, my heart forgot all rules and pounced like a child. I took his hand. His skin felt thin and hot, and so alive it hurt. Those days in the hospital were a strange blur of monitors and whispered medical words. People with badges spoke in terms I half understood: traumatic brain injury, burns, possible infection. They asked for signatures, next of kin confirmations, consent forms as if paperwork could translate into prayers. My sons were there, my boys from nights of paper boats and scraped knees, but something in their eyes was different. The worry was there, yes, but mixed in with something else. Calculations. Numbers hovered behind their faces like smoke from someone else's cigarette. On the second morning, Charles turned to me, voice careful, and said, "Mom, we've been looking over Dad's policies. There's life insurance and workers' comp. We need to think about the practical things." His words landed like a slap. Practical things? The man who loved me and who had fixed our leaky roof had been reduced to policy numbers inside a hospital room while he lay barely breathing. His health is what matters, I said, clinging to a truth that felt like a thin raft. Not money? He gave me a look like a man trying to be reasonable. Of course, Mom, but these things could be useful, especially if the worst happens. We have to be realistic. Henry echoed the same sentiments in a softer tone. I listened and watched and stored every twitch and slip of expression. I pressed my palm into Ernest's and felt him squeeze once, like he had been trying to tell me something. It gave me hope. It gave me a reason to watch and to not be fooled. 3 days later, the machines announced it was over in the kind of way that leaves no room for bargaining. The nurses worked on him. I screamed with my whole body. When the doctor said the words that make every heart stop, "I'm sorry," I thought I would fall through the floor. The men who had been boys in my house sat with their shoulders squared, making quiet arrangements. They were efficient. They were ready, almost too ready. When the funeral was set, Charles did almost everything. He chose a simple casket, a simple service. He said it was what Dad would have wanted. The truth is, Ernest had loved small things. He loved the regular. He loved being with the people who mattered. But the speed felt wrong. The small attendance should have been a red flag. Ernest had friends. His shop had been part of the town's muscle. You'd expect men who knew how to hold a wrench to hold his hand in the last hours. I felt cheated as much as I felt broken. At the graveside, the text arrived, the one telling me he was alive and the casket was false. It was the moment when the script of my life snapped. I had thought grief would swallow me, but this made grief hungry for justice. The unknown number had offered me a hand and I reached out. The days after the funeral, I moved like someone who had crossed into a life that demanded more of her than it ever had. Looking, asking, checking. I visited the bank. I visited the shop. I met with neighbors and I sat with paper and pen like a detective with a trembling hand. People asked if I was sure. They looked at my face and wondered if sorrow had taken a piece of me that would never come back. I wanted to shout that numbness is not the same as madness. I wanted to say that when a life has been stolen, grief and suspicion are sensible. At the shop, I expected a scene of wreckage if the machine had exploded. I expected charred walls, a collapsed bench, something to show that a terrible accident had happened. There was none. The shop was clean, neat, the tools in their places, his workbench polished. Not a scorch mark on the floor. The doorbell still chimed the same, and the strong smell of oil filled the air. It was as if they had told a story to cover something else. In Ernest's desk, I found a note. His handwriting always made me feel safe. This one was different. Short sentences, the kind a man leaves when he worries. Charles insists I need more insurance. He says it is for you, Margot. But something about it does not sit right. I do not trust him. The last line, "If something happens to me, trust nothing blindly," was underlined twice. I read the note until my eyes blurred, and then I read it again. Ernest had been suspicious before he died. He had written like a man trying to leave a map for someone who might be lost. That map led me to the bank receipts, the policy changes, the withdrawals. They were not small. They were deliberate. They were looking back, the first steps in a plan to make money out of a life. Someone had increased Ernest's life insurance from $5,000 to $50,000 in the months before his death. That is a large sum to a couple like us. It is enough to make a desperate person see a solution to a pile of debts. It is enough to make someone think the right, wrong way. At the town bank, I sat with Mrs. Thompson and watched the records that proved the changes. The signings looked hurried. Some signatures looked like Ernest's hand, but shook in a way that seemed forced. The withdrawals were often carried out in cash. The bank manager said Ernest had come in to withdraw money for repairs at the shop. But if repairs had been paid for, where were the materials? Where were the workers? The invoices were missing. The receipts were thin explanations for large transfers. I began to notice other things. Charles had been in the shop more than usual those weeks. Henry's interest in gambling had appeared like a stain on conversation, then turned into a pattern of borrowed money and urgent calls. Their lives had swelled fast and then contracted under quiet threats from poor men who lend money in back alleys. In desperation, people make choices. I am not naive, but murders are not choices that come easily to sons who grew up in your lap. When I confronted them, they smiled and said comforting things. "We just want what's best for you," Charles said. "We're doing this for your future," Henry added. He kissed my cheek like a boy, and yet I could feel the calculating warmth of their palms. Their ease with the documents and the funeral had been a lesson in how to move people to the edges of truth without pushing them over. It is a talent. It is, in the wrong hands, a weapon. A week after the funeral, a message came that made me breathe with a new kind of focus. Check the bank. The message had become a rhythm in my life. It told me where to turn next. I went back to the records and found more withdrawals I had missed, each one a small hole in our life savings. Next, the messages said, "Go to the shop. Look for what is not there." I found the note. I found the receipts. I found a letter from my husband, written as if he had known something terrible was coming. His letter was the key. He had recorded small lines, short phrases, warnings wrapped in casual words. He had hired someone, a private man, to listen and to watch. That is how I found Stephen Callahan. Meeting him did not feel like the beginning of an adventure. It felt like the beginning of a battle. He sat across from me in a cafe with a folder under his arm, and a look that said he had been waiting. He was gentle, not smoky or showy. He had the patience of someone used to holding other people's broken things together. He asked if I was ready for what he had. I thought of Ernest's hand squeezing mine in the hospital and said yes. He played a recording. Ernest's voice, small and a little wary, said things that made my chest hollow. The boys had been talking about life insurance. They had been making changes. He had suspected them. The recording trembled with ordinary words that became proof when put together. Later, another recording came on and the voice was Charles talking with someone about methanol and how it looked like a stroke. He was precise and cold. The words in that little device pierced me. How do you face the sound of your son planning the death of your husband? Vio pause. Sound, cup placed on table. Hearing that voice in a tiny speaker did something to me. It changed my grief from a raw wound to a weapon. It made me want to stand and to say to anyone who would listen that no matter their money or strain, I would not let my husband be a thing to be traded. The recordings were a gift wrapped in horror. They proved the truth when suspicion could be smiled away. But proof is only useful if there is someone with the courage to hold it up in a room that matters. The town police had been close to my family for years. Sergeant O'Connell had always been fair. He listened to Stephen and me in a small office lit by a dim bulb. He said the evidence was monstrous and asked if I wanted to proceed. I said yes because I had no other answer. I wanted the truth to stand. That night I slept better than I had since the hospital. Not because I had closure or peace, but because I had a direction. Grief can be a weight or a wheel. With the recordings, my grief began to roll. It did not make the hurt lighter, but it made the path clearer. I would not give in. Not to doubts, not to fears, not to the smiles of my sons. The folder Stephen carried that rainy day in the cafe felt heavy when he set it between us. He had photographs, recordings, and the quiet confidence of a man who had seen what greed looks like. He told me what Ernest had said, small things that, when strung together, formed a rope strong enough to pull men into the open. The first photograph that made my stomach drop was Charles leaving a hardware store with a small bottle in his hand. He had paid cash. His face was turned away, but the angle and date were clear. It was 5 days before Ernest's death. The caption under the photo read methanol purchase. Methanol. The word was a foreign, terrible thing, a chemical that could blind, that could mimic a stroke, a slow and painless instrument to steal a life. I looked at the photo and then at the recording. Charles' voice on the tape was clipped, certain. I already have the methanol, he said on the recording. It works perfectly because the symptoms look like a stroke or a heart attack. No one will suspect. So cold, so precise. His casual hunger for a way out of debt had become something monstrous. Another page in the folder showed a ledger of withdrawals, financial sheets with numbers like little black holes. Charles owed money to a lender in the city. Henry had been gambling. Their lives had been piling into a shape that makes people do desperate things. When they saw a chance to take from the man who had given them everything, they knuckled down. It's hard to say what takes a person across a line. I have had nights where I counted my life in pennies and wondered if I had failed. But there is a point where need is not an excuse. When Stephen first played the tape with their voices plotting to kill me as well, I felt the world tilt. Once we have Dad's insurance money, we need to get rid of Mom too, Charles said. Which is to say, they were not thinking of my future but of their own. They saw me as an obstacle that could be removed with a story of grief and a little legal paper. They planned a suicide to hide their guilt. They planned to make a widow into a tragedy. My 2 babies were planning to make me a set piece. I do not want to make myself into something I am not. I am not a person given to hatred. I have loved and been loved, and I carried those memories like talismans. But when the tape ended and the silence crawled in, I understood something about truth. It is sharp. It makes you act. We went to the police that night. Sergeant O'Connell listened as if he had been waiting for someone brave enough to bring him the key. Arrests are peculiar things. They move slowly, they hum with paperwork, and they require others to be willing to believe. The district attorney came. The lab was called. The medical examiner was asked to reopen the case. For a small town, This was the sort of thunderbolt that yanks at gossip and brings people out onto porches to stare. I remember the knock at my door the morning the police came for Charles and Henry. They were sudden and sure. The town seemed to stiffen. I had expected denial. I had expected pleading. I had not expected the hollow sound of a son's collapse when the evidence plays in front of him. When they played the tapes in a room of formally dressed men, and when Charles finally buckled in a chair, the sound was like the last page of a book falling softly to the floor. Henry tried to run. He ran like a man whose guilt was louder than his need for self-preservation. He got 3 blocks before the officers brought him back, panting and defiant. He looked at me like a man who had been caught with his hand in a jar. That look was not the boy who had climbed into my lap to read stories. It was a man shaped by other forces. The doctor who had falsified the death certificate turned out to be a man who liked easy cash. He accepted a sum and signed a word that turned poisoning into heart failure on a page. The lab reopened the samples from Ernest's body. They found methanol. Methanol in levels that could stop breath, burn the brain, and leave a family without a father. It was the final proof. It was also the deepest cut. I had believed in systems. I had believed that doctors had an ethic. But here was a corrupt convenience that had a price tag. When the evidence sat on the DA's desk, my life had the shape of a courtroom drama. I had to be ready. People began to look at me differently. Some came forward with kindness. Others stared like I had broken a vow of family secrecy. The town split along lines I had never imagined. Some people said we should forgive and forget. Others said evil should have a price. I understood both sides. I understood the aching wish to keep a family together and the stubborn need for truth. My point was simple. The truth mattered. If you could buy a man's silence or you could buy a doctor's signature, where did that leave the rest of us? Then came the night before the arrests, when I sat with the folder and the recordings and looked at every photograph until the edges blurred. I thought of Ernest's hands. I thought of the porch where we had shared coffee. I thought of my sons as boys who once put worms on the end of hooks and cheered when they pulled up a small fish. The man I loved had been murdered. The boys I loved had betrayed him. I had to keep myself steady. I had to be ready to stand up in a courtroom and say things that would make the world sharp and difficult. I had to be ready to lose the sons I had loved. If you have never had to choose between love and justice, consider this. Sometimes, love means letting go so truth can take its place. That was my choice, and it came with a cost that made my heart ache in a way that nothing else could. The town watched. People asked why I had not gone away, why I did not take the money and move somewhere safe. I had a house. I had memories and a life that were worth more than money. I had to make sure Ernest's name was not smeared with gossip and a simple, "It was an accident." I had to name the act for what it was: murder, premeditated, cold. If I did not bring that name into the open, then his life would have been turned into a ledger. At the police station, as the DA read the warrant and the officers moved in, I felt something strange. Not triumph, not peace, but the raw, focused sorrow of someone who had stood in a room where life had been planned and found it stolen. That sorrow had a backbone now. It would not let me tremble. It would not let me fold. After the arrest, the town clucked like a hen in a storm. Friends asked if I was going to the trial. Neighbors offered casseroles and hugs. The local paper wanted to interview me. The thought of telling strangers about the tiny, private details of our life made my skin crawl. But then I realized truth does not hide. It demands a voice. Pause. Sound. Page turned. The night before the arraignment, I sat on the porch and watched the stars. Ernest used to point out small ones and tell me, "They look like the stitches on a quilt." I did not tell him the truth about my fear then. I only breathed and felt the air cool on my face. I had a box of letters Charles and Henry had written as boys somewhere in the closet. I could open them and remember when they used to draw pictures for me. Those pictures existed still if I wanted them. That thought helped. the police told me the next steps. Evidence would be presented. The DA would file charges. The families would murmur. They told me to rest. That night I slept in a way I had not for months. Not because I was free of worry, but because for the first time someone had listened. Someone had put my husband's voice back into the room, and someone had given me the courage to speak. The courthouse smells like old wood and borrowed power. Men and women in suits walk and sit, and cameras find faces that want to be found. For Spring Creek, this trial had become a spectacle and a warning. People came with curiosity and with sorrow. They came because a neighbor had been killed and his sons were accused. They came because stories like ours once whispered become lessons that the town repeats for years. When I walked into the courtroom the day the trial began, I felt the eyes. Some were kind. Some were angry. Some looked at me as if I had torn a family to pieces. One woman, who had always smiled when I passed her house with a pie, did not look at me at all. She half turned away like a person embarrassed to be seen on a street where the wind had become harsh. Stephen Callahan sat beside me. He had come to be a steady presence, a quiet professional who looked at the room with the certainty of someone who had expected this. When the prosecutor began, his voice had the bluntness of someone who had to make a case out of pieces: recordings, bank statements, the doctor's testimony, the exhumed evidence. He did it with a clarity that made the room hush. They played the recordings. Each time Charles or Henry's voice came through the speakers, rows shifted and gasps slipped out like leaves. The recording of Charles talking about methanol and about how it could be made to look like a stroke was like cold water poured over the room. People leaned forward. Some covered their mouths. One lady left the room and did not come back that day. The DA had the lab reports. He had the bank records. He had the photographs of Charles buying methanol and the tape of Henry talking about the plan. It all added up and it all fit together. The doctor who falsified the certificate had been caught with cash and a pattern. Under oath, he gave an answer and then stumbled when the DA read the bank record that showed his deposit. It was as if a neat curtain had been pulled back and the mechanics of deceit were laid bare. I was called to the stand. There is a certain steel that goes through a person before they speak in front of a judge. It is the kind that steadies the hands and focuses the throat. I walked with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, but I kept my gaze on the jurors and the judge. The prosecutor asked me simple questions about my life, my relationship with my sons. I told the jury the truth in a voice that did not tremble too much. At one point, the prosecutor asked, "Did you ever suspect your sons?" I looked at Charles and Henry and said, "No, not for a moment. They were my boys." I said it because it was true. Loving someone does not always mean seeing the worst of them. I told them how Ernest had trusted them, how he had taken on their help, and how he had grown suspicious too late. I told them about the letter he had left, the note underlined twice, and about the tiny moments of concern he had whispered into the phone to Stephen. When the recordings were played in full in the courtroom, the sound of their voices felt like a betrayal all over again. The jury listened. The prosecutor rested. The defense tried to say their clients were desperate, that greed had driven them to a terrible plan, that perhaps it was not premeditated murder but a tragic mistake. The jury did not seem convinced. They had heard too many pieces of the puzzle click into place. Those weeks in the courtroom were a trial not just of evidence, but of community. People took sides. Old friends of my husband told stories of his kindness. Some neighbors came and testified for the character of the family, and others for the character of the boys when they were children. It was all heavy. It was all human. Courtrooms are weird like that. Places where private life is peeled like an orange and set on display. Outside, the town was changing. Mothers used my name as a warning. Don't trust anyone with more teeth than kindness. Coffees at the diner were full of new silences. The shop closed for a while, then reopened with another man behind the counter. My garden withered and then came back with the shock of someone learning to live again. On the day the jury returned, I sat very still. I had gone to the stand and told the truth. I had cried in places because truth sometimes requires tears. The prosecutor had made his closing argument like a person speaking to people who had the power to act. The defense had tried to move hearts with reasons. At the end, the room was full of the quiet that happens when a group of people understands a sentence and holds it carefully. Guilty. The word hit like a bell. The sound of relief was almost audible. Some people wept openly. Others nodded. Charles collapsed in his chair. Henry stared into the distance. I did not feel anything simple. I felt the weight lift, but not the pain. I felt a sort of small victory that tastes metallic on the tongue. Justice had been served, but Ernest lay in a grave that would not be changed. After the verdict, life did not return to how it was. The news spread like a ribbon of cold down every street. People said I had been brave. Others whispered that I had been cruel. I learned to live with both interpretations. Which one you give me depends on how you think about family. Was I cruel to reveal a truth that would send my sons away for decades? Or was I a necessary voice that prevented other families from being swallowed by greed? I had to live with both possibilities. I had to live with the fact that the boys who had once played under the oak tree were not the boys I had raised. 2 years after the trial, Charles killed himself in his cell. It was a letter of apology that reached me through prison handlers. Henry was broken in ways that meant he could not stand conversation. He tried to end his life several times. This is not something I dwell on to hurt myself. It is something I keep in a small box, so I do not forget the consequences of choices. The cost of lying and violence and greed reaches far beyond the money taken. I am not immune from guilt. I remember the baby pictures of them laughter-smeared and sticky with jam. I keep those pictures. I could hug those boys in my mind and remember their hands small and sticky, a different weight than what their hands carried when they were grown. I do not pretend it is easy to lose them in that way. I do not pretend there was no pain that came back to me when each dramatic thing happened. But I also do not pretend that turning away from the acts of murder would have been right either. The trial taught me something about truth. It does not always heal the wound. It sometimes makes the wound visible, and in doing so, it prevents it from festering. It shows the scope of what was done and names the people who did it. It does not bring back the dead. It does not fix a cracked life. But it keeps the harm from being hidden and allows the living to choose what to do with what remains. Outside the court, faces softened in ways they had not expected. Some neighbors came to my house and brought pies and casseroles and a sense of ordinary, steady care that felt like a salve. Stephen came often and sat on the porch with me. He did not talk about the trial much. He listened to me tell stories about Ernest and was patient when I repeated the same memory until the edges of it softened. He became a friend in a way that was not forced or pretense. He came in like a steady light, and I began, slowly, to return to the small rituals that had always held my days together. I planted seeds. I painted a wall a soft yellow. The sun in the mornings warmed the porch just like it had before. The house did not feel empty as it once had. It felt full with the memory of a man who had loved me. It also felt like a place I would defend. The months after the verdict were not a time of fireworks. They were a time of small things. I painted walls, mended a chair, started seeds in little plastic cups. It was the kind of work that teaches patience. You water, you wait, and then something green fibers its head up and asks the sky for more. I learned I could live with sorrow and still find pleasure in color. People who had watched the trial came by. Some brought food. Some brought their stories. A woman named Eleanor, her hair short and her hands worried, came to see me one afternoon. She told me of a brother who had done things to his mother's money, of small acts of betrayal that swelled into something terrible. I listened and I thought of the note Ernest left me. Sometimes the friendships you do not expect become the ones you need the most. I decided I would not use Ernest's life insurance for myself. The money felt stained. My husband had been taken by a greed that was not mine. I felt better finding a way to turn that money into a tool for others. I worked with Stephen and some lawyers and set up the Ernest Hayes Foundation for victims of family harm. It was a small, steady donation at first, legal aid, a private investigator's fee, psychologists for people who had been betrayed. Then neighbors donated, then people from other towns. Sometimes out of tragedy comes a thing that helps other people breathe. Running a foundation on a small town level is not glamorous. It is phone calls that ask for help and volunteers who put on bake sales and lawyers who donate an hour. It is also watching people find the courage to stand up and say that they too had been betrayed. It felt like honoring Ernest's memory in a way that kept the hurt from being simply an ugly secret. It felt like doing what he would have wanted, fixing something that had been broken. People have asked me if I regret going to the police. They ask if I would have been better off forgiving, letting sleeping things lie. I have sat with that question a lot. There are nights when I hold a letter from Charles and read the lines that make no sense and burn slowly in my chest. He wrote once, "Mom, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." Those words felt like a splinter. I could open and replay them, then choose to store them in a small wooden box like a memory that needed a lid. But I also say this: when a life is taken and the reason is greed, there is a moral duty to name the crime. Justice is not some triumphant ceremony in the sky. It is a small, stubborn process that says to future wrongdoers that there are limits and names. That is what I wanted for Ernest. I wanted his death to be named and not smoothed into a sentence that said fate had taken him. He did not die by chance. He died by the calculated acts of people who had been given everything and then decided to be dangerous. That naming mattered. Life went on. People in town slowly returned to ordinary things. The shop became a garden. Ernest's rusted benches turned into planters. Neighbors started to drop by just to sit on the porch and talk about weather or kids or the way the spring crocus always comes back. Those are little things, but they matter. They are the stitches that sew a life after loss. Stephen and I grew close. He would bring me a pastry, and we would sit and drink coffee like two people who had been through a storm. He never pushed me into a romance. He simply offered company and help when I needed it. He came across as someone who had done his job and who had no desire to be anything else but a friend. He seems to understand that I have learned to stand on my own 2 feet. Charles's death in his cell was a blow that nobody wanted to give me. I heard of it through a parole officer and then through the papers. Guilt can erode a person. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the weight is too much. There is no satisfaction in that. There is sorrow. Henry remains in a hospital for those with severe psychological needs. He sends letters that are halting and confusing. I keep them in the box because sometimes I like to remember the child who needed his mother's hand more than money. The foundation grew by small leaps. We helped a woman in a neighboring county find a private investigator and a lawyer that got her a fair hearing after she lost her husband under suspicious circumstances. She hugged me in my kitchen and cried. She said, "You saved my life." She was speaking to more than the money. She meant the courage to step forward. As seasons moved, I found new rituals. On Sundays, I go to the cemetery with fresh flowers from the shop-turned-garden. Ernest's headstone reads, "Ernest Hayes, beloved husband, betrayed father, honorable man." People told me the betrayed father part was harsh. I said no. He deserved a name. Sometimes neighbors ask if I feel lonely. Maybe I do some days, but loneliness is a shape and not a sentence. It can carry bright things too. A neighbor bringing soup, a child dropping off a drawing, a friend telling a joke. I have kept my memories and made new ones. When the sun warms the porch, I let myself laugh, and I let myself carry the stubborn pride of a woman who did not sit down and be quiet when a wrong had been done. The town still whispers sometimes. There are people who think I was cruel. There are people who whisper that family is always family. I think of those voices and let them be. There are answers to some questions that are only for my heart. I know why I did what I did. I know that Ernest, who loved fairness and just fixes more than anything, would have approved. Now, 5 years later, I plant sunflowers and roses. They grow tall. Friends come to the foundation for help. Stephen comes every Wednesday and brings a cake. We sit and we talk like two people who know the cost of being brave. Sometimes we do not talk at all. We hold our cups and watch the birds. My life is quieter and fuller. I find pleasure in small things. I cook the same meatloaf recipe sometimes and smile when someone says the seasoning is just right. I go to bed and think of Ernest, and sometimes I imagine him smiling and nodding at the work I built in his name. The entries to the foundation's ledger do not bring back the dead. They do not make the past less painful. But they do make our town a little safer. They make it so that one woman's voice can grow into a place where others can find help. That, I think, is a reasonable thing to build with the money that was taken at the cost of a man's life. When people ask if I ever forgave my sons, I tell them I forgave the children they once were, but not what they had become. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It is a decision made over time, like pruning a rose bush. You cut away what will poison the plant and leave what can grow new shoots. 2 years after the trial, Charles was gone. His death did not ease my pain. It made some things sharper. Henry remains in a place where the world can keep him safe. The letters he writes are small fragments of a man I barely recognize. Sometimes he calls me Mom, and sometimes he calls me by the name he used when he was small. I keep those letters in a shoebox, present and yet quiet. I do not know if I will ever read them all. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I will not. Life in Spring Creek continued the way small towns do, murmurs and kindness in equal measure. Children grow into the people who will tell your story and shape it into a cautionary tale. I do not mind that. Some share my face as someone who chose truth. Others see me as someone who broke a family. Both stories exist. My garden became a source of healing. Ernest's old shop is a mosaic of marigolds and lavender. People come and pick flowers and sit and talk. The smell of fresh dirt is an honest thing. It cleans you in a way that conversation sometimes cannot. The foundation grew. It did not change the world, but it did change a few lives. We helped families get legal advice. We helped buy plane tickets for someone who needed to testify. We paid for a mental health counselor for a mother who thought she was alone. I got letters that said thank you. Those letters rest in a drawer like small bright birds. Sometimes reporters call. Sometimes they want to make the story into a documentary. They ask me questions that are tough and then softer. I tell them about the small things. A man who loved to fix bicycles. The woman who can still sew a collar without looking. A son who once made paper airplanes and tried to throw them all the way over the fence. I tell them about the trial and the verdict like a person telling the weather. The facts are the facts, but the life behind them is what I hold. On the 5th anniversary of Ernest's death, we had a small ceremony at the cemetery. People came from around the county. There were speeches about justice and about grief. Stephen gave a short talk, and then we planted a tree. One whose roots would grow and make a shade that I would sit under in years to come. That tree is small yet and will take its time. It is like me in a way, planted and patient. What I would tell a person listening to this now is not a sermon. It is a simple human thing. Notice the people you love. Ask questions when you feel a small click in your bones. Protect your rights, yes, and keep your humanity. When someone you love is accused or when someone you love fails, do not rush to a verdict of the heart. But do not be silent when a wrong cry rises. I have learned that the truth has a stubborn habit of finding light. It might take time. It might come in small messages on a phone at a graveside. It might come with a private investigator who sits in a cafe and hands you a folder like a strange kind of gift. It might come in a doctor's lab report. The heart of the thing is simple. If you listen and if you act with care, then you do right by the one who cannot speak. The house smells now of roses and of bread sometimes. Stephen and I drink coffee on Wednesdays. We laugh, we remember. When I look at the little garden where Ernest's bench used to be, I see something clean and soft. I go to the cemetery and talk to his stone. I tell him about the foundation. He listens in the way the living imagine the dead listen, with a kind of quiet approval. People ask what I would say to my sons if I ever saw them again. There are so many things. The simplest is this: I mourn them as the boys they were. I am sad for what they lost in becoming what they were accused of. I cannot take back what they did, nor would I want to. The law did its part, and life did its part, and we have to keep living in the world as it is. I would tell them I hope they one day find a way to be whole, that they understand that money taken by killing cannot buy back what is lost. I would tell them that love with boundaries is the only true kind, and you, the person listening to this story, keep your own light. Keep your mind open to the hard facts and your heart ready for the soft ones. When a wrong is done, speak up. When someone you love is failing, offer help before it becomes too late. And when grief comes, let it have space. Let it break you, and then let it teach you to stitch yourself back together. If you like this story and want to hear more, we have other stories of ordinary people who faced hard choices and found their way. I will keep telling Ernest's story because he deserves to be remembered as a man of simple goodness, as the reason I did not let his death be a quiet thing swept under a rug. He deserves that truth. Thank you for listening. If this moved you, please leave a kind comment below. Tell me where you are from. If you can, support efforts that help victims of family crimes in your own community. Sometimes a little help from one person makes the difference for another. My name is Margot Hayes. I stood up for the man I loved and for the truth. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this: love does not mean silence when someone is hurting. It means action that keeps what is right.